Back in those days, the most impressive band, hands down, was the Beatles. They were the best band in the world. There will never be anything like the Beatles, and you really had to be there to understand what I've just said. Nowadays, younger people think the Beatles were just a band, but they weren't. They were a huge phenomenon all over the world. Everybody changed because of the Beatles, even politicians. The Daily Mirror in London ran a page every day about what they were doing. Imagine a big national newspaper devoting a page a day to a band? They were more than huge. The Beatles revolutionized rock and roll, and they also changed the way everyone looked. It seems ludicrous now, but for those days, they had very long hair. I remember thinking, wow, how can any guy have hair that long? Really, it was just combed forward with a slight fringe over the collar. We all had quiffs then, before the Beatles. It had been DuckTales and Elvis. I was lucky enough to have seen them play at the Cavern Club in Liverpool back at the beginning. They were really fun, eating cheese rolls while singing. And they used to tell a lot of jokes. They were hilarious. They could have been a comedy team. And they had weird guitars that none of us had ever seen. John had his Rickenbacker, and Paul had that violin-shaped bass. All the rest of us had Stratocasters. I mean, a Strat was the ultimate you could wish for. Gibsons weren't even around, and George, I believe, was playing a Hofner Futurama. God help him. Later on, he got a series of Gretches. It was like, what? These weird guys with long hair and these funny guitars, and they're posing in their shirt sleeves with their ties pulled out. Everybody else was wearing these horrible, rigid suits, encased in these terrible 10-button, suffocating Italian jackets. So that was quite a revelation. And the Beatles were hard men, too. Brian Epstein cleaned them up for mass consumption. But they were anything but sissies. They were from Liverpool, which is like Hamburg or Norfolk, Virginia, a hard seafaring town. All these dockers and sailors around all the time. They'd beat the piss out of you if you so much as winked at them. Ringo's from the Dingle, which is like the Bronx. The Rolling Stones were the Mummy's Boys. They were all college students from the outskirts of London. They went to starve in London, but it was by choice to give themselves some sort of aura of disrespectability. I did like the Stones, but they were never anywhere near the Beatles. Not for humor, not for originality, not for songs, not for presentation. What you've just been listening to are the autobiographical recollections of one Mr. Lemmy Kilmister, founder of Motorhead and king of rock and roll, if you ask someone who knows. And I'd like to think I do. I'm a lover of rock and roll, not an expert, but I'm here. And I'd like to talk to you about the Beatles today for the first of what I'm sure will be many installments. There are simply too many things about the Beatles' existence that change the existences of other elements of music, art, communication, and human culture in general to really sum things up in one episode. And if I did, it probably wouldn't do anyone any good. There's no point in me sitting here and giving a general overview of the career of the Beatles. You can find that on YouTube very easily. You can find that through a ton of documentaries. You can open any book about rock and roll and read about the history of the Beatles. So I have absorbed a lot of different sources, and I just can't do them all justice without having multiple episodes here. My first big information binge on the Beatles came from the book You Never Give Me Your Money by Peter Doggett, which I highly recommend for people that don't even care about the Beatles or care about rock and roll. If you like a good business story, if you like a good story of what happens to creative people that start multiple businesses in the name of art and altruism and friendship, and then watch it all fall apart one teeny tiny piece at a time. It also does a great job of dispelling a lot of myths about the Beatles. If you're into that, you can forgive a lot of people, I think, from back in the day for maybe blaming Yoko Ono for their breakup, but it's very clear by all the documented stories and business transactions and shots fired in the press between the Beatles that they didn't need her help breaking up that band. Essentially, it's a book that chronicles everything each of the Beatles did from the times they really stopped getting along in the studio together towards the end of their recording career, and up through the creation of the Beatles anthology series in the early 80s, miniseries, excuse me, and their various solo albums that came out after that, up until the death of George Harrison. There was a lot going on those years, of course, mostly moved and shaken up by John Lennon, going to America, coming back, going to America, coming back, putting out a lot of albums. Well, Paul McCartney started putting out albums with his other bands. Well, I mean, Wings was multiple bands with his wife, basically. And it's a missed opportunity to make a great film along the lines of, I don't know, let's say The Social Network, based on that chunk of the Beatles' life. You know, partners making business decisions and the adverse effects that those have on a group of people that used to be in it for the same thing. Okay, I've never seen The Social Network. I just know what it's about. I was too busy watching movies like Backbeat and Yesterday for you, so I could tell you about them today and urge you to watch one and maybe just ignore the other or put it on, I don't know, as something pleasant enough. If you're with people that like that sort of thing, they might really like that sort of thing. Anyways, let's start with Yesterday, because it's more recent and it's a quicker study. Yesterday came out in 2019 and is very cute. Your mom, your aunt, your stepmother would watch it with you, and as soon as it's done, say, it was very cute. I think that is exactly what happened in my case. Directed by Danny Boyle, of all people, the guy that gave us Trainspotting and 28 Days Later. It does a couple things really well. It's a modern, slick sort of presentation of a down on his luck musician with a lot of heart and a lot of good intention and some craftsmanship and some ability, but not as much as what he will sort of step into claiming for his own. And that is the entire back catalog of Beatles works. It does sort of a nice attempt at a awkward love story thing between two young people that have been in each other's lives for a long time. The scenes with his family are great. Scenes with his friends are great. It's interesting, but it does not do some basic things that, I mean, the more movies I watch, the more I realize that an episode of The Twilight Zone or Tales from the Crypt would have done this better. That is, establish a premise, establish a problem, establish the reason for the problem, and not leave you wondering when it's all over. Wait, what was that all for? Why did I... What? In this case, what it's all for is just being sort of a love letter to the Beatles and their music. It is... If this was created by in an alternate dimension, this was created by the people at Apple Music that were originally hired by the Beatles back in the 70s, I think it was. They got to make this love letter to the Beatles music because in an alternate dimension, Apple Music lived on in its original form, but not in our dimension. And by the way, another dimension would have been a perfectly reasonable plot device to set up the weirdness that takes place in this plot. The plot is all the lights go out one night while a young musician is bicycling home and he gets hit by a car, wakes up in the hospital, and then after he comes out of his sort of temporary one-day coma, I think it was, he's the only person who remembers who the Beatles are. He's the only person who knows their songs. So his music career takes off when he basically starts using that knowledge and goes out on the road, opening for Ed Sheeran, and eventually takes the headliner's place with Ed Sheeran opening for him, gets a big record deal in LA, and gets wooed away by Kate McKinnon, who does a really great job of playing a sort of overbearing record label executive. Granted, she's pretty fantastic in everything she does, even when it's garbage. But through all this crazy whirlwind of success happening, the main character's best friend and manager and long-suffering female admirer, I guess, gets sort of left behind, and at a very pivotal moment for what would be a standard boilerplate young person's love story, she gives him the ultimatum to tell her that he loves her or lose her forever. And in a very unreasonable way, he's got to get on a plane in a minute and a half to go make his record, or his entire career's over. It's one of those, it's something that would be in an episode of New Girl, maybe, when after you've watched enough seasons of New Girl, or you've watched them over and over again enough times, not saying I have, but just enough to realize that the main character, Jessica Day, is terribly unreasonable and a complete tornado of destruction and awfulness to all the people that care about her and support her. And only because she's being portrayed by somebody that's so inherently likable and talented do you go along with those plots. So in general, I'd say none of the sappy love story stuff is earned at all by the writing or the setup of the characters, but it does a couple of nice things. It does introduce Beatles songs to, I'm sure, a whole audience of young people in the modern era that maybe weren't familiar. And it also does a very nice, let's say, alternate universe look at what would have happened if John Lennon got to live out the rest of his days being an artist and a painter. And, didn't get murdered because he was in the Beatles. And the gentleman that portrays him, actually, in that scene, must be a favorite of Danny Boyle's, because he was in Trainspotting as Begbie. He was also in The Full Monty as Gary. He's in The World Is Not Enough as Renard, a terrorist who is trying to kidnap some heiress that is being protected by James Bond, in one of the crummiest of the 90s era James Bond films. It's the one with the gal from Wild Things who used to be married to Charlie Sheen, and it's the Christmas joke episode. It's the Christmas only comes once a year joke installment of the James Bond series. Don't get me started on the James Bond stuff, because I can talk about that. But I won't. I will say that as crummy as that James Bond movie was, Roger Ebert said that film was a splendid comic thriller, exciting and graceful, endlessly inventive, and gave it 3.5 stars out of 4. Whereas the other Beatles movie we're about to talk about, Backbeat, he gave like 1.5 stars and said it struggled to find a plot anywhere in it. And that is why Roger Ebert is garbage today. There's a lot of other reviews of his you could look up and realize that he was garbage. Although, for all I know, he was a very nice guy. Anyways, what was I talking about? Oh, yesterday. So the movie does nothing to set up the whole global event that takes away the memory of the Beatles. It also does nothing to explain how the rules of this strangeness, this singularity are supposed to work, or how to get things back to normal. I guess it all just happened because the plot needed it to happen, because there wouldn't have been a story otherwise. I guess it's a good movie if you like Ed Sheeran, too, because he's in it quite a bit. And the message of the film is basically, ooh, if you think Ed Sheeran's good, the Beatles are even better. Because there's two nice things that I will say about how the movie represents the Beatles' work and the songcraft of the Beatles. In one scene, the main character is having a little song competition with Ed Sheeran, and he plays Beatles tunes, and Ed Sheeran's like, well, I can't beat you there. That's definitely better than anything I've ever done. You're a genius, mister. Which is, the film's way of saying the Beatles are better than everything that's new in pop music today, and you young people should listen to this if you like Ed Sheeran, because it's even better, and he sure likes it. And the other part that's actually really effective is when the main character is upstairs in his room with his best friend, not yet girlfriend, and she's looking at all the pieces of paper on his wall that have Beatles lyrics on them. She doesn't know that he hasn't written these songs. Everyone in the film assumes he's written these songs. And she gets a little jealous, and she points out to him that clearly she's never had a piece of his heart the way whoever the woman he's writing about in these songs has, which I thought was nice. I think that's a pretty great way of explaining how well the Beatles wrote about love and how complicated it is to have someone else look at that and go, "Oh, you'd never write that for me." Now that I think about it, there's similar to a scene in the Full Monty where the main character, I think played by the same guy that plays John Lennon in this movie. Oh no, it's not him. I take it back. Anyways, one of the characters of the Full Monty, his wife busts him for having a thong in the laundry, and she's like, "You'd never wear this for me. You must be cheating on me." If you haven't seen the Full Monty, I remember it being very good when I was young. Anyways, that's enough of that. Let's go back to a movie that came out when I was young-ish, a little before the Full Monty. It's called Backbeat. And the first thing I heard about this movie was that it was going to be portraying the Beatles in Hamburg, and it was going to feature a soundtrack performed anew by modern musicians like Dave Pirner from Soul Asylum, Greg Dooley from the Afghan Wigs, who was doing the vocals for John Lennon. Excuse me, Dave Pirner did the Paul McCartney vocals. Thurston freaking Moore of Sonic Youth was playing guitar. Don Fleming from the band Gumball, who I'm not familiar with at this time, was playing guitar. Mike Mills from a little band called REM was playing bass, and at this time they were kind of the biggest band in the universe in a lot of ways. We'll get to that someday on another podcast. It is strange, but even with the Metallicas and the Guns N' Roses and things happening in hard rock and alternative, REM was kind of at their peak of just about to be. I think they were just about to release the album Monster, which was gonna basically kick them out of the number one singles club and put an end to their pop domination and just kind of get them back to their own fan base for the rest of their career. Anyways, besides those names, the biggest one that was being passed around was the fact that Dave Grohl from Nirvana was going to be playing drums, playing Pete Best drum parts. And I know Henry Rollins of the Rollins Band and Black Flag does some of Stuart Sutcliffe's vocals as well. I hate to say it, but I didn't know that when I just rewatched the film recently. I would have paid more attention if I had and picked out the spots. But what are you going to do? All life is regret. All life is woe and loss. Speaking of woe and loss, this movie Backbeat is a great film, underrated for its time. Definitely should have done better. But it is the best example of a band being portrayed playing live that sounds like a band that plays live, that played live together, that they look like the band you're hearing, they sound like the band you're looking at, unlike almost 80% of the films I'm watching for this little podcasty project. So, high marks for that. Great use of the actors in the scenes when they're playing their instruments. I mean, the fellow that portrays Paul McCartney in this film looks and sounds just like Paul McCartney. And you'd never know he's not left-handed and doesn't play bass because the director is smart enough to not focus on that aspect of his playing, to not focus on him when he's on stage unless you see him singing. If you can't find this film to watch it yourself, you can get a tiny glimpse of what I'm talking about if you look up Money, That's What I Want, by Backbeat Band on the YouTubes. Currently, you can see the clip that was sent out to the MTVs and other video channels back in 1994 to sort of get people fired up for this movie release. I even heard a wrong chord in there, I believe, when I listened to it today. It sounds like a real, fired up, sloppy-ish, upstart kind of band playing together that loves playing together. It's really cool. The energy's fantastic. And I have to say, as good a job as Stephen Dorff does portraying Stuart Sutcliffe. We're not familiar with Stuart Sutcliffe, really, unless we're diehard Beatles fans. Even if you were a diehard Beatles fan, you'd be familiar with him through a couple of photos, maybe, and some of the audio from the Beatles in Hamburg that was recorded. But the actor Ian, let me get this right, Ian Hart, who portrays John Lennon, is dead on, and he's incredibly just talented at all the quips and the great back and forth banter with Stu. He captures what a mover and a shaker and a motivated guy John Lennon is. This is really the story of two friends losing their best friendship as the Beatles become the Beatles. It's also the story of Stuart Sutcliffe falling in love and ending up leaving the Beatles for his new photographer girlfriend that he meets in Hamburg, Astrid. And it's an amazing love story. It'll bring back a lot of good feelings if you had, a fantastic love affair when you were in your early 20s, let's say. Also, if you are a musician and you've played clubs and you played also, especially long sets in one night for very little money, you'll be able to relate to this story. It really does humanize the Beatles in a way that hasn't been done, I don't know, well, not since, but I think there was a film in '79 called Birth of the Beatles that dramatized a similar sort of era. I don't know if it does the love story thing, but a lot of great work seems to have gone into making this very accurate for the time it's presenting. One of the only things I could pick out was the fact that George Harrison, at one point on like their second or third trip back to Hamburg, is playing his first black Gretsch duo jet from 1957, I think is the year it was built, which he called his first real decent guitar. And I did enough research to find out he wouldn't have had it until later in that year or the following year. It's pretty negligible. But the presentation of them as a hard rock and roll band that's hopped up on pills so they can play 6 to 8 hours a night with, going back and forth between like strip teases and then getting back on stage and doing their thing. It's fantastic. And the reason why America was so blown away, I think, by the Beatles' attitudes when they came out, more so than the UK, was they weren't ready over here for a band of four young guys that had sort of an off-putting look, but were so clever and so good with a microphone in front of them and so funny and entertaining. And a lot of it stems from the chemistry they developed in Hamburg, first of all, as a band of people that had to look out for each other and defend each other against a lot of outside influences. But also, the Hamburg crowds were not having this just stand there and play your guitars sort of approach of a rock band from out of town. They're used to almost cabaret style all-day entertainment. Very similar to, okay, maybe not exactly similar, but somewhat similar to the days of vaudeville, when people would just stay in a vaudeville theater all day long and for not very much money expect to see jugglers and strippers and joke tellers and fire eaters and singers and dancers and everything. These crowds demanded jokes. They demanded physical humor as well as songs that entertained them. And they would yell as much at these young guys from Liverpool until the Beatles started to develop a thick skin and some rapid-fire joke responses and a little more of their own kind of act. So, whereas they appeared on the shores of America as seemingly fully formed comedy geniuses that also played beautiful music, at least if you ask the kids, it took some real hard living to get there and not much money for for all of that. To speak of the appearance in America, I will have to go back to an anecdote my father told me about seeing them on what must have been the Ed Sullivan Show, I guess, the first time, and hearing them play and sing. And as soon as they finished the last note of the song, right behind him, his father on the couch, when my dad was sitting on the floor cross-legged in front of the TV as close as he would be allowed to sit, his father said, "Well, I guess you just don't need to be able to sing anymore these days." Something to that effect. So these angels who, at least to me, they sound like angels, but I love Slayer. Honestly, they have some of the most beautiful sounding harmonies in all of pop music history to the ear of most people that like rock and roll, right up there with the Beach Boys, which is another thing that we'll get into in another podcast episode. But because, the British harmonizing that was influenced by some American country music is not the same as, let's say, the Beach Boys harmonizing that's more influenced by American music, strangely enough. But to put yourself in my grandfather's shoes and the shoes of all those people that had fought in World War II and had, let's say, 10 to 12-year-old children or maybe 7 to 9-year-old children at that time, let's just say If you go to a YouTube or something right now and you look up bands like Deicide or Venom or let's say Napalm Death or Cannibal Corpse, listen to a song by any of those bands. That's what my grandparents' generation heard when the Beatles sang, I Want to Hold Your Hand. And the long hair, good Lord, going back to Lemmy's recollections. He was working in a factory at one point as a youth, and he said he grew his hair until they fired him from the job because he just felt like it was killing him. They said, put your hair in a hairnet or you're fired. I said, I will not wear a hairnet. My granny wears hairnets. Real men like John Lennon and Kirk Douglas do not wear hairnets. So they said, fired. My stepfather never forgave me because he got me that job. He recalled when the Beatles came along in 1962, they had hair to just above the tops of their ears. Outrageous, I remember thinking that. It wasn't, of course, but we were still in war hair. The only reason very short hair came in, I found out later, was in the First World War in the trenches to fight the lice and fleas. Before the First World War, a lot of people had long hair. So those are the days. Hair that touched the top of your ears was a fireable offense. Even years later, in the later 60s, members of Aerosmith talked about getting kicked out of high school because they had long hair. Out of school, kicked out, fired from jobs for being a man, having hair over the tops of your ears or covering them. God forbid. Another funny thing about the Beatles is they did so much in such a short period of time that I think a lot of us that are too young to have been there don't realize what a strong backlash there was against them, depending on what era of them you kind of fell in love with. I've listened to recordings of an old, it was years ago, but it was an old Seattle DJ, like a famous DJ, maybe from KJR or something like that, if you're from the area. He was sharing his recordings of interviews with the Beatles or public appearances with the Beatles, and he was narrating them many, many years after the fact. They were on compact disc, and I got them from the public library. And even though I wasn't even a big Beatles fan at the time, I was curious about rock and roll history. I should have done this a long time ago, clearly. Anyways, he was so biased in his presentation of these little treasure troves of tapes that he'd saved. He was prefacing and contextualizing the experiences he was about to play for you with these were the fun-loving mop-top Beatles, nothing like the cynical, psychedelic, drug-using Beatles that would come along a year or so later and shocking their fans with such controversial statements as them being bigger than Jesus. They really were the biggest thing since Elvis, who was the biggest thing since Martin and Lewis, who were the biggest thing since Harry Houdini. Really, when it comes to entertainment figures that captivated, more than one country at a time through the media and through their legendary entertainment exploits, and people just wanting a piece of them, people filling up streets to get a glimpse of them wherever they were. Those are really the biggest landmarks from the era of I guess, film and recorded visual media on out and radio. Obviously, things like the Beatles anthology covered their public personas and the shift of their perception in the media pretty well. You can get into all that stuff in video and film, blah, blah, blah. I can't do better than that. But I can take you back to the early days of the Beatles. And let's talk a little bit about the trip to Hamburg that they made. Back in the late 50s, there was a coffee bar called the Jacaranda in Liverpool on Slater Street, which is just nearby the Liverpool Art College where Stuart Sutcliffe and John Lennon were attending. And Paul McCartney was at the Liverpool Institute right next to the college. They had their group together. They were trying to play clubs. They went to this coffee bar and tried to get in there. They got a couple of gigs, but they didn't have a drummer. They actually were paid to paint the bathroom. John and Stu were, because they were art students. And eventually, the guys asked Alan Williams, who ran the place, if he would manage them, because they knew he managed other bands. So he said he would. He got them the gig in Hamburg, and they auditioned drummers until they got Pete Best ready to go. And they went up that way to basically play out the whole story of the movie Backbeat. And there, Stuart meets Astrid, who is a German gal who's a photographer. And she's the one who sort of defines the early look of the Beatles that you think of in your head when you think about the black and white photos of them standing in front of a train trestle with leather jackets on. That is her work. She is the one that also got them to kind of change the way they combed their hair. The part at the beginning of this episode where Lemmy is talking about the ducktails, the duck's ass, the quiff, the Elvis hair, all that stuff, all that Gene Vincent looking greasy hair. That's the way they were combing it then, even though it had been a while since, say, the emergence of rockabilly hairstyles and teddy boys and such. I think they kept it around longer in England than they did in America, perhaps. Actually, I don't know that. I don't know that at all. But let's set the scene a little bit as far as the rock and roll world and the world of teenage rebellion and the world of music. I mean, we are in the teen pop idol era. Chuck Berry's in jail. Buddy Holly's dead. Elvis is in the army. The Everly Brothers are going into the Marines. Eddie Cochran's dead. Gene Vincent's very much alive and will be for a while. Jerry Lee Lewis is blacklisted because the English press exposed him for marrying his 13-year-old second cousin. This is time for record labels to step up and fill the gaps in the talent pool with younger, more malleable performers that they can control. This is a very stunning parallel to the mid and late 1990s when this movie came out, actually, funny enough. You know, this is after Kurt Cobain kills himself. Pearl Jam, for a while, stopped touring and making videos. I mean, they never really went back to cranking out videos, but, you know, they said they were not going to tour if they had to go through a company like Ticketmaster, and they tried to go through alternate companies that just couldn't handle the volume, and a lot of those shows just didn't work out very well, and they had to come up with another working model, which eventually led them to come back to Ticketmaster. Around the same time, the Smashing Pumpkins follow up Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness with Ava Adore, which is a big left turn for them stylistically that alienated a lot of fans. Soundgarden breaks up. Rage Against the Machine will then break up a few years later. Nine Inch Nails will go on hiatus. Alice in Chains will cease to be a functioning unit and peter out, or start petering out, as they hope to get Lane Staley back into working shape while he's on his way to dying slowly alone in the early 2000s. So after all of this comes Mickey Mouse Club alumni, Christina Aguilera, Britney Spears, and Justin Timberlake, along with American Idol, which sets off 2 decades and more of singing and dancing contests on television to make it absolutely clear to you young people everywhere that you haven't got a shot at ever being a pro musician or any musician of note that's worth listening to, unless you do stunts in front of a panel of millionaires who couldn't care less about your career and will be absorbing most of the profits of whatever you create for them if you're the 1 in a million billion that wins the contest. So, back in the late 50s and early 60s, instead of Britney and Christina and Backstreet and O-Town and Jessica Simpson, the kids then got an earful of Bobby Vinton and Bobby Rydell and Bobby V and various others, possibly not even named Bobby at all over here in America. When the Beatles formed, all the bands in Liverpool had names like Jerry and the Pacemakers, or Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, or Johnny Kidd and the Pirates, or even Derry and the Seniors. And when they got Alan Williams to sort of bring them on as manager and get them some gigs, he told them that their names stunk. And he called them the Silver Beatles and booked them under that name to start with. Incidentally, it's at this time that Paul McCartney went under the nom de plume Paul Ramon, which, if you ever want to argue the amazing influence that the Beatles had in even the most teeny tiny minutia-oriented ways, the name Paul Ramon was what the New York City band The Ramones took their name from. The world's most influential punk rock band was obsessed with the Beatles. Let's get back to the film. Now, the gentleman that plays John Lennon in this is fantastic and a great actor. And it's no surprise that he's had a lot of roles in a lot of television and films since then. What I love is that he actually played the role of Professor Quirrel in the first Harry Potter movie. Not a big deal if you think about the fact that, well, he was the main antagonist that didn't go on to other movies necessarily, but kind of a big deal in the fact that Yoko Ono was in that movie. So the director of this film, Ian Softley, went on to direct films like K-Pax and Hackers. Co-writer Michael Thomas was already responsible for Lady Hawk with Rutger Hauer and Matthew Broderick and Michelle Pfeiffer, directed by Richard Donner. But he would also be responsible for The Hunger in 1983, starring one David Bowie and Susan Sarandon, directed by a Mr. Tony Scott, brother of Ridley Scott, who would go on to do, I don't know, a million amazing things, including Top Gun. The part of Astrid Kirchherr, the photographer that Stephen Dorff's character Stu Sutcliffe falls in love with in this film, was played by none other than Laura Palmer herself from Twin Peaks, Cheryl Lee. Cheryl got to have some time with Astrid when she was making the film, and Astrid was nice enough to contribute some of her thoughts and memories in audio form on the digital versatile disc of this program. She definitely had a photographer's eye for the Beatles. She didn't think of them in terms of personalities as much as she thought of them in terms of visuals. She said she loved looking at them. She loved them all together. She loved seeing them in formation. She loved their faces. And I think that's probably why she was so clever about restyling their hair and the way those hairstyles framed their faces. And she's very open and she's very opinionated about the fact that, you know, the boys, when they came up there, they were still combing their hair like they wanted to be Elvis or Gene Vincent. They had these ducktails, duck's ass, you know, which is the swooping all your hair up and then back and then coming together in this inverted part, I guess is one way to look at it. Look up the word duck's ass, I guess, in men's hairstyles in the 50s. But, you know, you see it in movies like The Outsiders. You see it in movies like The Lords of Flatbush. You see it in Happy Days, for crying out loud. But she's very, very upfront about the fact that she hated his hair. And she saw a beautiful man that she wanted to look different, to look the way she thought he should present himself. I mean, that's love, right? That's someone saying you're so beautiful and you don't know what to do with yourself. I can see what you need to be doing with yourself. And if you're a woman of the time, the 60s, and you have that feeling and that attitude towards a man you're in love with, and his closest friend is also very protective, of course, there's tension there. That's one of the things this film does a good job of portraying, is when someone falls in love with someone who has a deep bond with someone else as a friend, I mean, there's always the impulse to protect someone you care about, right? From romantic interference by anybody socially, let alone when you're in a band with that person. And if you haven't been, you don't know. But let me tell you, it happens, especially when you're young and you're territorial. And you know, you might also have a thing for this gal if your best friend wasn't involved. Again, to repeat myself, and I can't say it enough, it's a good love story. It's a really good, especially young person in their early 20s artist love story. Stu is not born to play rock and roll. Stu is there because John loves him and wants him in his band so they can stay friends forever. Because why not? Why wouldn't you? But his life just goes in a different direction. And I think with the fullness of time and the timeline being what it is, and the head injury he'd already sustained, God, what a good life as far as being on your way up and having a lot to look forward to and your whole artistic life ahead of you. And, you know, it is a shame that he had to suffer and that he had to die suddenly. But, I mean, come on. Being in the Beatles in their formative years and then falling in love and realizing your true passion for art and taking a stand for it. Oh, God damn. It's beautiful. It's really, really beautiful. I think this mentality is fresh in my head because I've been absorbing so many tragic stories of people like Chris Cornell and Andy Wood and Buddy Holly and Richie Valens. And you look at all these people that really, I mean, they had so much ahead of them if they could have stayed on Earth with the rest of us. They could have produced a lot of great stuff, even if they stopped being an artist and just produced other people and helped other musicians. But Stu knew he was on his way out of the Beatles and as a musician. Anyway, more thoughts about Astrid before I start wrapping things up. She's very much a person who thinks of things in terms of aesthetics and composition. Angles, lighting, just like Stuart Sutcliffe probably was realizing in his own life, in his own art, he should probably be around more people like that and not the stuffy English art school arbiters of success that he was trying to please. Stu had bought a guitar with money he won in an art contest. So, since he was John Lennon's best friend, he was in the band. George was a lot younger than everybody else, dangerously so because his lack of adult status got them kicked out of Hamburg eventually, as is portrayed in the film. But he was really in the band because he was a great lead guitar player, and his mother would let the group practice in their home. Pete was the son of a club owner that Alan Williams booked in. Alan, had been told by his contacts in Hamburg that Liverpool bands were all welcome, except the Beatles, especially since they had no drummer. So Alan decided, well, it's time to go get them a drummer, and here's the first one I know. When they got to Hamburg, they were booked at the Reeperbahn, which is Hamburg's more extreme version of, if you're an American, Las Vegas. There's open prostitution on storefronts. There are women wrestling in mud in storefronts, in windows. The Beatles would play clubs like the Kaiser Keller and the Star Club. They were assigned a German fixer sort of guy, like a bodyguard type, who had been banned from various other clubs on the Reeperbahn for killing a sailor who had gotten out of line. He was someone to guide them and protect them and be some muscle around them. Let's say in case they got mixed up with prostitutes who didn't admit they were prostitutes right up front, and then after a few nights of love making, might send their pimps after you if you didn't have any money to give them. That kind of a thing. A big tough guy to sort of steer them away from that kind of trouble. There are recordings from the Hamburg era, which is not terribly surprising since they were trying to get a record deal at the time. John and Paul had written over 100 songs together. By the time they went back to Hamburg again for another run in 1960, when they recorded as Tony Sheridan's backing band on a rock and roll cover of My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean. The backing track you hear in the recorded soundtrack of this film is actually the Beatles playing. I think it's an actor singing the Tony Sheridan part, though. So I'd say there are three main factors that influence the Beatles and kind of make them who they are from here on out. Number one, The fact that a lot of American records came into Liverpool via the ships that their citizens worked at. So even after someone like Cliff Richard became the new face of pop music in London, Liverpudlians were still absorbing the rhythm and blues and rock and roll straight from the United States. Then the fact that they had a hardworking, blue-collar attitude towards songwriting, which a lot of songwriters don't, or a lot of wannabe stars don't. That 100-song catalog we were just talking about. And also the desire to be crowd pleasers. Even as tough as they were getting, they still had the influence of the overbearing German audiences shouting "Mach Schau" at them, because they're used to a lot more than just strumming guitars for 7 hours a day. They want some jokes, they want some pantomime, they want some fun. And likely the kind of fun that'll make women want to hang around. They like the idea, I'm assuming, of good-looking guys being fun and pleasant. And if failing that, something to laugh at while they're entertaining women on their laps. And eventually the huge songbook of theirs would include guitar arrangements of pleasant old standards like they'd eventually play before the royal family early in their career. They had good manners that way, but Hamburg did simultaneously make them harder, more aggressive, and tighter as a band. When they came back to the Merseyside scene, they could just slay the competition. They started drawing crowds and firing them up to react wilder than the other bands could. People would be rushing the stage for this new version of the Beatles, not the old version from Liverpool that, were just sort of fighting for time on in the same bill as Jerry and the Pacemakers. There's a lot more to talk about when it comes to the Beatles after this, but I think I'm going to have to save that for something else, another episode. I don't know what other movie that would correlate to. I'm not going to wait around to find one necessarily, because the Beatles have had control over their own properties for a long time. They've fought each other for the control over their own properties for a long time. Maybe I'll do a Lord of the Rings episode, because as every school child knows, John Paul, George, and Ringo wanted the rights from J.R.R. Tolkien to make a Beatles-centric adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, with John playing Gollum, and I believe it was Paul to play Frodo Baggins. I would also like to mention, for the last note about this film, which I think is wildly overlooked and underrated, you can tell a lot by a restaurant or a cinematographic expert by their reviews online. And when I went back to try to find myself a copy or a watchable stream of Backbeat, I noticed that there were two standout Amazon reviews, at least in America, which might be something very, indicative of American criticism. One said, please stop with all the bare breasts and the naked women. Ridiculous. As if the tale of a teenage Beatles in, the red light district of Hamburg, Germany, wouldn't have any female nudity. And a very prominent negative review close by that one was, please, we get it with all the homosexual implications of John and Stuart. Please, just stop. Stop trying to convince us that they were gay for each other. I would say that after spending so much time in detail on the movie Airheads and then jumping into this one, the movie Backbeat was a very, very nice and refreshing, bold statement about a rock and roll band. It was very much committed to what it was, and it inspired certainly a lot of different responses from different people, depending on what their internal bias was, and that's just as well. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'm still learning my way through this, whatever it ends up becoming. But just a reminder that rock and roll is wonderful, and we are lucky to have it for as long as we've had it. And you are also wonderful, and the world is lucky to have you for as long as we get to have you.